So just because a machine learning model performs well when we train it and when we test it, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to have a positive clinical impact. And there's a few further steps that we need to take to make sure that that is the case. Firstly, we need to make sure that the model works well when we apply it to new data that it hasn't seen before. And then we also need to make sure that it is a positive clinical impact that it's having when we do actually apply it and use it in a clinical context. In terms of making sure that it applies well to new data, we want to avoid two things called underfitting and overfitting. And just to demonstrate what those are, we have a couple of graphs here, and on the left graph, this shows underfitting. And basically in underfitting, your model does not fit well onto the data. It doesn't map the relationship appropriately. So for example, if we have this curved relationship and we're trying to fit a straight line onto it, we're just not going to get a good mapping from inputs to outputs. That's different to, let's say, overfitting, where actually you're fitting it kind of too well. As we can see in this data, we wouldn't really want to have such a wiggly line going through all these points, because now if we try and read it off, let's say we're trying to predict the values based on a particular time. At this time it's going to be low, and then we move just a little bit more in time, it's going to go high, and we move again, it's going to go low again. So in those cases, our model is kind of fitted on too much onto the data. It's kind of basically that the model is too complicated. So here we've used a linear relationship, which the graph for that would be y equals mx plus c. Here maybe we've used what's called polynomial, so we've used like y is mx plus nx squared and x cubed, and you've added all these different variables that's made such a very complicated model, which actually it doesn't work well in practice. So really what we're trying to get is this middle point, which is a good fit where our line goes through all of these points and it just basically fits well. So that's really the aim, and that's something that we need to interrogate when we train our models to make sure that they haven't overfit or underfit on our data. And underfitting to some extent is less of a concern, because if your model just doesn't work, it's just not going to work, and that's fine. You'll be able to tell that. But the problem with overfitting is that you might actually think your model is working really well until you try and apply it to a new setting. So there's a few things that we can try and do to reduce the risk of overfitting. The first one of those is that we just want to use lots of data, and the more data that we can use, the less likely it is to overfit, because ultimately, if you imagine on this graph, we're adding in all these extra points around here, it's just going to be much harder for the graph to make this complex relationship which fits over all of these different points. So it's just going to move more towards smoothing out and finding a more kind of generalizable algorithm and a more generalizable mapping, but it's not like kind of a surefire way necessarily to prevent it. But obviously you can only do this up to a certain extent. You can also just opt to make less complicated models. So rather than in these models having x squared, x cubed, x to the power of 4, etc., you would actually just drop the more complicated ones and maybe have x and x squared, and that should be enough to map onto those. In a machine learning context, we have lots of different levels of models that we can use. So for example, neural networks, particularly as they get deeper, they can be very complicated and make these very complex mappings. And I did talk about how neural networks work in an earlier video and the way that they make these very kind of complex relationships. So you could just simplify a neural network. You could maybe reduce the number of layers. You could reduce the number of parameters that are going into the model, or you could opt to use a simpler algorithm. So maybe something like a support vector machine or a logistic regression. And if you're not familiar, the names aren't too important, but basically these are just a bit simpler than neural networks. So again, there's a lower risk of you overfitting on that data. And a third thing that you can also do is you can actually deliberately penalize the algorithm for complexity. So it's a technique called regularization. Without going into too much detail, when you design the method by which you're going to kind of optimize the model and find the best fit of the model, you introduce this term which makes it so actually the model tries to be less complex, and a more complicated model is not going to perform as well if you include this regularization term. So then it's just going to be a less complicated model. The main, I guess, takeaway is that overfitting occurs when you have very complicated models, and so the ways that you can reduce the risk of that is by reducing the complexity of the models. There's a few different ways that we can do that, and also increasing the amount of data can help with it as well. There is also a particular type of overfitting, which you may well be familiar with before, which is called confounding. And basically what happens in confounding is when you have a confounding variable, let's say we have A, and we know that A leads to B. And in our case, A is smoking and B is pancreatic cancer. So we know that there is a relationship there, so that's fine. We can train our model to look at whether they smoke and output the risk of whether or not they get pancreatic cancer. But what can also happen is there might be something else that is related to A, let's say C. In our example, let's say that C is the amount of coffee that somebody drinks, but then let's say that actually of all the people who smoke, more of those drink coffee. But coffee doesn't actually lead to increased risk of pancreatic cancer. However, because people who smoke are more likely to drink coffee, then actually there would still be a correlation with people who drink more coffee and cancer. But it doesn't mean that actually that's causing it. So what can then happen is when we have a model which maybe doesn't have smoking in it, but it does have coffee, then it might identify that there's a relationship here between coffee and cancer, when actually coffee is not the cause. It is actually just the whether or not you smoke. And there's been a few examples of confounders in medical studies. So for example, one group found that when they looked at chest x-rays and they tried to identify which ones had more serious pathology, some of the chest x-rays were done as portable chest x-rays in people who were really sick. And the algorithm kind of latched onto that fact rather than interpreting the chest x-ray itself. It said that these ones are actually more serious, but it was looking at the fact that it was a portable chest x-ray rather than interpreting it. And another example is where it was looking at the presence of chest drains. So for example, it found that people who had chest drains in, I think it was that it predicted a pneumothorax, which kind of makes sense because that's why they have the chest drain in, but you ultimately want an algorithm that can predict the pneumothorax without there being a chest drain. So it kind of overfitted onto the presence of a chest drain on that chest x-ray. And there's a few other things in medicine as well to also consider. So sometimes you will do scans on different types of machines and they'll just take slightly different types of images, or maybe process the images and store them in different ways. You want to make sure that the data that you train your model on is representative to the population that you then use it in. So for example, you want to have a good spread of the right types of diseases. You want to have the right sort of demographics, maybe the right age and those sorts of things, because let's say you train a model to analyze chest x-rays in the UK and it gets really good at spotting certain pathologies. If you then take that to India, where there's way higher prevalence of tuberculosis, for example, then the algorithm which might not be as good at recognizing tuberculosis. So you want to make sure that your algorithm has seen all these pathologies before you then try and apply it to that population. So when you're then applying these models, you can use the same performance metrics that we talked about in the previous video, things like precision, recall, AUC, etc. What I'm now going to talk about is how we quantify the performance on a clinical setting and what the clinical impact is. So the first thing to consider is how are things going to be incorporated into clinical workflows? So for example, if the model is going to be giving alerts, then who's going to use those alerts and how's that all going to work? There's been a couple of studies that have looked at making early warning systems for acute kidney injury, for example. But if you're making a lot of alerts, how does the decision-making process look like? So is it a case of it gives an alert and therefore you're automatically going to give them fluids? Or are you going to bear that in mind and maybe give them fluids or maybe not give them fluids, or just monitor them in a particular way? But you just need to think about how exactly is the algorithm going to be used, because it's feasible that if you had an algorithm and it's predicting acute kidney injury and then everybody gives fluids, then actually that might make things worse, because you might give fluids to people who are going to develop acute kidney injury, but then maybe some other people weren't going to develop it and you gave them fluids anyway and it actually made them worse. So it's really important to think, exactly how is this algorithm, how is this model going to be used when you then apply that to a clinical setting. It's worth also bearing in mind alert fatigue. So if you had something that kind of gave an alert every time someone's looking at chest x-ray, it comes up with a flag of, oh, we think there might be a pathology on this. Maybe that would be really helpful if it's pretty specific and it doesn't come up a lot. But actually, if you're really sensitive and you're kind of giving up loads and loads of alerts, then people can get alert fatigue and not really pay much attention to the alerts as they're still coming. And that in itself can be quite problematic. And sometimes there are unforeseen consequences of a model that you develop that maybe you just wouldn't predict before you used it. And I think one nice example of this is that there was a chatbot that was designed to deliver cognitive behavioral therapy. And there's been a few that have been developed, but there's one that was developed and applied in Japan. And they did a trial with it where they offered it to people and they saw, how did they rate their mood and their anxiety. And what was interesting was that while these chatbots have been shown to be quite effective in other areas, and there's been studies in the US and elsewhere, in this study they found that actually the amount of alcohol consumption was actually higher in this population who are using the chatbots. And the authors thought that maybe this would be because the chatbot is kind of prompting them to think about their thoughts, and that's maybe leading them to think more about what's making them unhappy and more likely to then consume alcohol. But ultimately, if you're making a chatbot to help people with depression and anxiety, you wouldn't necessarily expect that to happen. And it can be quite tricky to think in advance exactly what is going to happen and trying to avoid any of these unforeseen negative consequences. But this raises the importance of having good evidence, having good studies that have been designed to both quantify the model's performance, but also quantify how well does it perform when we apply it in that clinical setting. And as many of you I'm sure are aware, there's different levels of clinical trials that we can use to provide support for a model both working and also not causing negative health consequences. So just to recap, we have the retrospective study, which is where we've already collected the data, we build our model, and then we apply that model on that data that already exists. And that's in comparison with prospective studies, which is where we build our model and then we collect data real time and we look at how would that model perform on that data. And then within prospective studies, we have randomized control trials, which is basically where you're collecting that new data, but you're actually using your algorithm to make clinical decisions and seeing what the impact of that is. And really the gold standard is this randomized control trial, because that really shows you, if you're using your algorithm and you're making decisions with it, what is the impact? Does it improve health? Does it have any unforeseen consequences? And until we have good randomized control trials to back up the use of these algorithms, we can't be certain that they are definitely having a positive health impact and that they're not having a negative health impact. But so far, there's not been a lot of randomized control trials that have been done. I think there's around 6 or 7 that I'm aware of to date, but ultimately, this is the kind of evidence that we need to back up these models before we then apply them. So we just want to take maybe some of the things that we're hearing in the media with a bit of pinch of salt. The majority of the studies that have been done so far are retrospective, and that makes sense because you want to do retrospective studies first before you then go on to do prospective studies and randomized control trials, because you want to have a reasonable idea or an indication that your algorithm is going to work before you actually then use it to make decisions. But it just means that it takes time. We have to get to the point where we have a lot of randomized control trials that are being used in medicine. Right now, we're not there yet. We don't have a huge number of studies, but it's just worth us bearing that in mind when we're kind of like appraising the current state of AI being applied to healthcare. And hopefully in a few years' time, we'll have lots of randomized control trials and we'll have a lot of evidence of really positive impact of AI in healthcare, and hopefully lots of studies showing that there's not these unforeseen negative consequences. Typically, when we go from a retrospective to a prospective study or a prospective to a randomized control trial study, the performance of the algorithm tends to drop. So sometimes we see really promising retrospective studies, but then when we do them prospectively, they actually don't work as well. And this was the case in one of the first ever kind of like AI-based screening tools, which was used for screening for breast cancer. It was found that retrospectively it looked really great, but then it was actually clinically implemented, and when they looked back at the data, it seems that it maybe didn't help and may actually have been worse than when it was human screening for the breast cancer. And one really interesting example of a randomized control trial that has been done is in China using colonoscopies, where basically what they did is they took the whole sample population of people who needed colonoscopies, they divided them into 2 groups. In one of the groups, they had the doctor performing the colonoscopy and the images were being reviewed by a second doctor. In the other group, they had the same doctor or another doctor doing the colonoscopy, and they had an AI reviewing the images as well and trying to raise if there were any polyps that maybe the colonoscopist missed. And what they then found when they kind of measured those outputs was using the AI as the second screener, it actually did a better job at picking up some of the polyps that the colonoscopist missed. And this, I think, is quite a nice, in support of this idea that doctors and AI can work well together, because the AI was picking up different types of polyps. It was typically picking up flatter polyps, which maybe the doctors are just less good at picking up. So in combination with the colonoscopist, obviously performing the colonoscopy, having this AI then screening that was really helpful and obviously led to a better overall outcome. Just before we finish up this video, there's a couple of other important considerations. So firstly is about regulation, and the FDA have said that they are going to treat AI models as medical devices. But one of the difficult things about AI is that when we train our model initially, we're training it on some data and the model learns how to perform in that particular way. But maybe later on in time, we're going to have more data and actually we can retrain that model and performance might improve or it will change in some way. That kind of poses a bit of a challenge, because previously when you developed an AI, when you developed a medical device, you were just going to use that medical device as it was. Whereas now the AI tool, which is a medical device, might change over time, and therefore we need to think about how we're going to regulate that. Like, are we going to have to do kind of regular performance checks? Who's going to be responsible for that? And there's various other associated issues around this regulation. So it's still kind of being figured out at the moment. There's not a clear regulatory framework and guideline that's been followed and implemented, but the FDA and the other regulatory bodies are in the process of doing that at the moment. And another related consideration is with interpretability. So when we're using these models, we want to ideally have them as interpretable as possible. We want to know, why is that model making that decision? Because then we can interrogate it. We don't want to allow things like bias. We don't want the model to use anything that's not really making sense when it's making its decisions. So we kind of want to push for interpretability as much as possible. That can be a bit tricky because with deep learning algorithms, classically they're this kind of black box algorithms. So you give the input and it gives an output and you don't necessarily know what's going on in between it. But there have been efforts made to try and increase the interpretability, and there have been some really good strides made, and there's various different techniques that we can use. So for example, with convolutional neural networks, we can use things like heat maps. We can use kind of occlusion testing, which is where you kind of black out different parts of the image and you see how the performance drops when certain different parts are blacked out, and using the rationale that if you block out a key area, then the performance is really going to drop a lot. So that gives you an idea of which sort of areas the model is looking at. And you can also actually extract the layers themselves and have a look at what those features show, and that can again give you an indication of the sorts of things that it's looking at. So ultimately, it's really important that we come up with high quality evidence to back up the use of machine learning algorithms in healthcare, make sure that they perform well, make sure that there's not any adverse consequences of that model. And I think we should just be careful with some of the overpromising language that we use, because we don't want to accidentally maybe inflate the performance of these algorithms and lead the media and the general public to think that they're doing more than they can, because that might lead to bad decisions being made and ultimately not lead to the positive impact that we want to see these kind of models having when we apply them to healthcare. And then hopefully over time, we'll start to see more and more of these models being developed. We'll see more and more use in healthcare settings. We'll see these models that are improving our ability to provide care. We'll see doctors kind of better supported with these models and these ability to process data, and generally a better healthcare for everybody. So I'm really hopeful about that. I hope that that's coming in the future. I hope that if this is something that interests you, then you can also get involved and help us to bring machine learning to healthcare in a positive, safe and effective way. So in the last couple of videos, we've talked about how to assess the performance of these models and how to assess their clinical impact. In the next video, I'm going to talk about how to read a machine learning paper so that you can appraise the current state of affairs and understand the area so that then you can also contribute to it.